Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey, it's Jessa here, back for another episode of the Better Sex Podcast. So glad to be here this week, and I'm so glad you are here with me. I would love to hear from you. If you have comments, if you have questions, if you have ideas for the podcast, please get in touch. You can always go to bettersexpodcast.com. You can send me an email, or you can record a question at the bottom of every page. There's a little, what they call a widget, where you can record a question, and I might even answer it on a future episode if you do that. I would also like to invite you to be a Patreon of the show. If you are a regular listener and you're enjoying the podcast, I could use your support. For as little as just $2 a month, you get advance access to every episode. I'm not talking about big dollars here, but it all adds up. And if you're enjoying it and you want to support the show, if you want to keep me from ever taking advertising, that kind of thing, you can go to Patreon, which again, you can find on the website, and pledge a small monthly amount. And it goes to, the cost of producing the show. This week, I am talking to Steph Auteri, who wrote a book called A Dirty Word. And it is her own personal story of coming through an abusive and coercive relationship and her own struggles around feeling, broken and inadequate, thinking something was wrong with her, with the way her sexual desire worked, things like that. At the same time that she went into a career as a sex writer. And as she was contrasting what she's learning about and writing about with her own experiences and the whole journey of where that's gone, culminating in her raising a daughter now and what she wants her to know as she moves forward. Fascinating conversation, fascinating book really about her own personal story and the larger context of our culture that basically makes female sexuality a dirty word. It's a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And if you've got comments or thoughts about it, I would love to hear from you when you're done. Hope you enjoy the show. Steph, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So I would love to start by giving you a chance just to sort of introduce yourself a little bit and talk a bit about the book.
Sure. So I have been writing about sexuality for more than 15 years. These days, I do mostly journalism work. I write about rape culture and consent, sex education, and my book encompasses a lot of this. So I tell people that my book is my big fat Me Too.
Okay.
It's pretty much, it tackles how our culture often treats female sexuality in particular like a dirty word. But in addition to tackling all those big issues, it also contains my own story of how I became a sex writer in order to fix what I saw as broken in myself, only to realize that I wasn't broken at all, and neither are any of us.
All right, so speak a little bit more to that. Like why did you become a sex writer? And then what prompted really tackling writing a book?
Sure. Well, I sort of fell into sex writing accidentally. I was looking for college internships, and I got a call from an alternative weekly. They needed interns for their new media department. I thought that meant I'd be writing for the weekly itself, but it turns out that they owned 2 personal sites, one of which was very adult in nature. At the time, I had just come out of an abusive relationship. It was emotionally, sexually abusive, and was actually my first sexual relationship. So I went into this internship feeling a bit out of my depth, but I soon realized that I could use it as sort of a form of shock therapy to reclaim sexuality for myself, to figure out what made me feel good, to enjoy sex on my own terms. And my entire career, I suppose, snowballed from there.
Wow. Okay. So it really became an opportunity quickly to be like, wait a minute, I can do this differently, or I can learn something through this.
Right. Which, I'm sure not most people would go into such a situation realizing that, because, you're just reviewing toys, you're reviewing porn. It's nothing deep about it, but it was just at a time in my life when I guess I sort of needed that.
Yeah. Okay. And so you had thought something was wrong with you before going through that?
Yes. After this sexual relationship, which was primarily negative, my first sexual experience was coercive. I continued to have sex with him because I felt that I loved him, but he continually belittled me in bed and did not take into account what I was ready for, what I wanted, what I felt comfortable with. So I came out of that relationship, number one, feeling very uncomfortable with sex, not really wanting it, feeling like I was doing it more out of obligation than anything else. And number two, not even seeing how I could engage in sex in a way that was pleasurable for me.
Okay. Yeah, and you're saying this is your first sexual experience, right? So it's not like you had something to compare and contrast with.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I ended up continuing to write about sex after that internship because at the time there weren't a ton of sex writers all over the place. There wasn't a different sexpert for every publication out there, and editors were really hungry for people who were okay with writing about sex in a way that had a little bit of humor, that had a lot of honesty. And after that internship, I felt very comfortable doing that. So I just kept going. And after a lot of time, I found that I was writing about different things. I was becoming interested in the medicalization of female sexuality. So I began writing a lot about that. When I had a daughter, I became interested in sex education. So over time, it became less about, I'm going to review these sex toys, and more about, public health policy,
right,
and so on. I just saw that with every big change in my life, there was also a corresponding big change in what I was writing about. And after a time, it just made sense to me to explore this in book length form.
Right. So did you set out for this to be your big Me Too story?
Well, there was no such thing as the Me Too movement when I started writing this. I started writing it 7 or so years ago.
Oh, wow. So you were ahead of the times.
Though to be fair, this has always been a timely topic. It's just more visible now.
But was that your intent to tell your own personal story of what had happened, or was it more about trying to gather all these things you've been writing about at arm's length for all this time?
Well, at the beginning, when I started writing it, it was focused on my own personal story, and what I wanted to do more than anything else was to put a story out there that other people could relate to put out a story that maybe people could connect to, but had previously felt uncomfortable talking about themselves. Something that can make them feel less alone in their own experiences. And I worked on the book with that intent for a number of years. But after a time, and after my daughter was born, especially, I felt that the book needed to be about a whole lot more than that one terrible experience and my struggles around it. I felt like it needed to take a good hard look at all the ways in which female sexuality is, treated like a dirty word. I'm going to throw that phrase out there again.
Yeah, well, that's why it's the title of the book, right?
I feel like a broken record. But no, I felt like I had to look outside myself a bit more.
Yeah, the way I'm hearing what you're saying is you have your story and it's within a context, right, of our culture. It's one story of many, and this idea, especially of female sexuality being the dirty word. So how did the book change from what you conceived? Were there other parts of it that you didn't even intend to include, or what was the transformation over all these years? So
at first, it was just this personal narrative of feeling that perhaps I was in some way dysfunctional, that I was suffering from female sexual dysfunction. So I thought that I would write about how funny it is that I'm a sex writer who has problems with sex, and what does that mean, and what can I do about it? And I thought that I could connect with other women who perhaps also felt this sense of inferiority in the bedroom.
Yeah.
But as I became a mother, and as I learned more and more, and as I worked with other people within the field of sexuality, I realized that the question of female sexual dysfunction was just this tiny, tiny thing, and there was so much more that I should be exploring. I became concerned, especially when my daughter was born, with the world that she was going to grow up into and what this would mean for her sexually. So I started looking at rape culture and consent. I started looking at how women are treated around fertility and infertility. I started looking at how the system of sexuality education in our country is so bifurcated and it is so lacking. And I feel that all those different topics sort of fit into different moments of my life. So I could I could retain this personal story, but at the same time explore all these different larger issues.
Right. I can see how your story would touch all these various different bigger components.
Especially considering that it took me so darn long to write.
So how would you distill down the various, I'm trying to think how to ask this question, the various factors at play in our culture, all the various ways in which our sexuality is the dirty word. Like, what are the different forces at work, I guess, that you'd like to see change or that need to be illuminated?
Well, lately I've been focusing on sex ed and how sex ed needs to start at an earlier age for kids, because I feel that's really where we start learning how we treat each other, how men treat women, how women treat men, what we think about each other, and how we end up growing into this place where we treat our sexual relationships in a certain way, the way we interact with each other. So for me, sex ed is the starting point. And with the way things have been lately, I don't exactly feel optimistic about where sex ed is going. But it's the thing that I've been focusing on more and more ever since finishing the book too.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to see sex ed in earlier grades in school. I want to see parents taking on a larger role in their kids' sexuality education. But beyond that, how can we push back against this conditioning that we've had since we were born? That's the larger question.
Yeah. And
that's the tough one to tackle. I don't know if you read Jessa Crispin's Why I Am Not a Feminist.
Oh, no, I haven't.
So Jessa Crispin, Why I Am Not a Feminist, she writes about the ways in which feminism is failing us in this moment, because it's not seeking to topple the systems that we're living within now and rebuild, but is instead just choosing to gain ground for women within the system that already exists. And while she doesn't answer how we could topple and rebuild, I feel like that's at the crux of it.
The picture I'm getting in my brain is that we're in an abusive relationship in this culture.
Right.
And if all we're trying to do is get permission to go out to dinner or, gain ground within this, we're still in an inherently abusive space.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, just taking a quick break. Be back to the show in just a minute. I want to invite you to be part of the conversation. I've started a private Facebook group where I share resources, where I go live online to answer questions in office hours twice a month, and where we are going to have a conversation and a discussion and support among people who are committed to their relationship and to their intimate life. I would love to have you join me. You can find the link at bettersexpodcast.com/community. I mean, you start out to write such a personal story. Is this something that your friends and family already knew? Was this a sort of revelation? Were you worried about that at all?
Well, I've been writing so many of these personal pieces for so many years that my friends, at least, and my husband, pretty much knew the entire story, or most of it. But one of my largest fears in publishing this book was that my parents would finally see the full story. I mean, when I first started writing about sex, they were like, oh, this will just be a phase. It won't last forever. But we can support you now. Hooray. Let's share your clips with all our friends.
Right. You'll grow up and get a real job someday.
Right. Exactly. But as I've gotten more personal in my writing, they haven't been reading any of that stuff. They don't really do the internet. And most of my stuff is online. So they haven't been reading any of these things. And my great worry was that, this was going to be the first time they would see the extent of how terrible that first relationship was, number one.
Yeah.
And number two, they would then somehow find a way to blame themselves for not being able to protect me. And that was my big fear with them. And, when my mom first started reading the book, she in fact talked to me on the phone and said, reading this, if you weren't my daughter, I'd just think, man, this girl has been through a lot. And I was like, well, it's common. It's pretty common, the stuff I'm writing about. And then she said, I feel like I failed in some way. And that was exactly what I feared that she would feel. So it was terrible to have her read that and think that, because she in no way failed me. I mean, it is the culture that fails us.
Yeah, but I was going to ask that. I mean, aren't there ways in which your parents, I guess I don't want to say failed you, but perpetuated. Like you're doing it differently with your daughter, right? So isn't there some truth that, I'm thinking in a broader way too. The clients I work with, and even in my own life, it's like there are things we got from our families that don't serve us so well, and that maybe set us up to end up in a certain kind of relationship or have a certain mindset. It seems like there is, some degree of accountability there. That
there is some of that. There's the ways they teach us gender norms and the way they sort of keep their mouth shut about sex.
Right.
Because they're worried that we're not ready to hear about it. Though how much of that is because of how they grew up and what their parents taught them about sex or didn't teach them about sex. Right. I mean, I feel like I can't blame any of our moms or dads.
Yeah.
Because I feel that the importance of teaching your kids about sex was maybe not as visible or not as widely known at that time.
Right.
The importance of taking that on for themselves versus relying on, one terrible class in high school.
Yeah. Did you have a favorite part of the book or a hardest part of the book? Is there any part that you really wrestled about? Am I actually going to publish this or not?
Well, my favorite chapter is the chapter called Pretending to be the Cool Girl, where I write about how I am sexualized by both men and women when they find out that I write about sex for a living. The assumptions they make about me just because I write about sex, the way they treat me differently.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed writing that because I really liked the way in which it ended up building this connection between me and everyone else who does work in this field of sexuality. I found out pretty quickly that it was easy for other people to relate to this. And beyond that, it's just sort of this version, some heightened version of how all women are treated every day anyway. So I felt like it was an interesting way of looking at ways in which women are treated in general.
Yeah. What was the hardest chapter, or the one that maybe you thought, maybe I won't put this in there?
Oh God, the one that was like pulling teeth for me to write was the chapter called The Word I Cannot Say. And it was about how we define rape and sexual assault and whether or not we are able to claim that word for ourselves, to use it to define our own experiences. And I still grapple with the word. And my fear in putting that chapter out there was that my own experience was, not as terrible as other experiences. So who am I to write a whole book about it and throw it out into the world? I mean, Roxane Gay recently put out that collection, Not That Bad. And I feel like that's exactly what many women feel about their own experiences. Oh, my experience wasn't that bad.
Right.
Who am I to complain?
Yeah. At this point, where have you settled with how you label what happened to you?
I mean, I talk about it as a coercive experience, a coercive, shitty experience. Because, it's interesting. I don't even think that he would have even realized that he did anything wrong.
Really?
Really, absolutely.
Wow.
I mean, we continued to have a sexual relationship after that first terrible experience, because at that point I was like, well, I have lost my virginity. Might as well continue doing this. I still love him.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much responsibility he takes for his own behavior.
Right. And it doesn't sound like you've confronted him. I mean, at least directly, right?
No, I have not.
Right. Because some of the, in some of this Me Too movement, there have been direct, hey, this is what you did, or this is how I experienced it.
Right. No, I mean, he's been out of my life for many years, and I'd love to keep it that way.
Yeah, right. I can understand that too. Yeah, I mean, the book ends in a very forward-looking way, right? How do where do we go from here, right? How do you see yourself personally moving forward? How do you said you have a daughter. Like, what direction are we going in? Or where do you think we should go?
Well, again, I'm gonna plug the importance of sex ed, and it's why I am writing so much more about sex ed lately, and it's why maybe I think if I write another book, it will be focused on sex education. But on a personal note, I am just focused on her and what I can teach her and how I can prepare her for the world that's out there. I mean, I can't fix how all the men out there are being educated. I mean, I could do as much advocacy as I can for early childhood sex education, but the most I can do personally is with my own daughter,
right?
And so preparing her for the realities.
What do you want her to know? Like, what are the messages, the core points of what you want to instill in your daughter?
I want her to know that she doesn't owe anyone anything, that if she's going to engage in a relationship, sexual or otherwise, it should be about what she wants and what she's ready for. And she doesn't need to do anything she's not ready for. And I want to teach her about boundaries. I try to teach her about boundaries, which, I feel is still early. She still won't let me take a pee by myself. But I want to teach her that she has the right to say no to anything. And so that's what I'm trying to instill at her at this early age.
Yeah.
As much as I can. And I'm just trying to build on it and make the lessons more complex as she grows older.
Right. Right. And to circle back around to your personal story in this, how did you get that healing, or where have you ended up in terms of your own, I don't know, your own sexuality, your own autonomy around expressing that?
Well, for a long time, I operated under the assumption that I did have some form of sexual dysfunction. But as I worked more and more with sexuality researchers and counselors and therapists, I began to learn more about how female sexuality is pathologized, how we're made to think there's something wrong when really what we're experiencing is, for the most part, very normal and very common. So over time, I began to feel less that I was a problem and more that, okay, maybe I'm not always on the same page with my partner, but this is something we work on together. And then eventually I read Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are, which is amazing.
Yes.
So amazing. So when I read her book, it really hit home for me that just because I was the one who maybe wanted sex less often, it didn't mean that I was the inferior one in the relationship. It didn't mean that I was the deficient one in the relationship. It had nothing to do with who wanted it more or less. Once I started treating myself less as a problem or less as the problem, it was freeing. It was freeing for me.
Well, and which would unleash some of your desire too, right? Like feeling like we're broken or the problem is not a turn on. That's
no, because there's this endless cycle of guilt and pressure and then resentment, and it goes around and around. And who wants to have sex when you're feeling all of that?
That's the topic of my whole book, actually.
Excellent.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, but I'm also struck in listening. When you think if female desire or function has been demonized, right? First, we have the context of the relationship it's in. Like you're talking about this first relationship. Like, why would you want sex with somebody who would coerce you and be so not attuned and
absolutely
manipulative?
Right.
There's that too, on top of just how our libidos function, even in the best relationship, right? Like it's really complex. Yeah.
I know there's so many things that affect it. So
yeah.
It's crazy.
Right. Well, it's a gift. I mean, I'm really glad you wrote the story and that it's out there to share in the world, because I think people are going to resonate with it. And I think you're touching on topics that are, virtually universal.
That's my hope. That's my hope, that people just connect to it and it either makes them feel less alone or it makes them feel that they can talk about it.
Yeah.
Because, I've already put it all out there, so why not?
So where can people find out more about you? Where can they find the book? Like, I'll put some links in the show notes too, but do you want to say just a word about, getting in touch with you for reading your writing?
You could find all of my information at my website, stephauteri.com. There's a page there on the book as well, where you could also find buy links to Amazon, to your local indie bookstore. Go Indies, always telling people to support them.
Right.
I'm also on Twitter at Steph Auteri and Instagram at Steph Auteri, and you'll find a mix of the sexy sex, cat photos, my daughter, books, whole mishmash of things.
Well, your personal story, right?
Exactly.
Life, so that's great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show and talking about the book, and I'm really happy to support it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.